This happened 4 years ago. I lived in Staten Island for a few years because I went to college there. I was about 20 years old at the time this happened. One late evening, I went to a Need for Speed screening in Manhattan, unfortunately all alone because my friend bailed on me at the last minute. I love Aaron Paul and Kid Cudi, and I just had to go see it even if it was all by myself. As some of you may know, Staten Island is part of New York City, but it's still very far away from everything. After this awesome event, I headed back to my dorm in Staten Island, which resulted in the longest and scariest trip of my entire life. When I transferred to 2-to-1 train at Chambers Street, and while waiting for another train, this weird guy suddenly approached me out of nowhere and asked for my name. I think he told me his name was Chris or something like that. I lied to him and told him my name was Sophia and kept walking away from him. He then offered me some candy, which I declined and found quite strange. This was around 9:30 p.m. or so. And of course, welcome to New York City, the train was taking forever to come to the station, which freaked me out even more. He started to hover around me, asking questions like where I'm from, what school I go to. I lied about every single thing, of course. He told me he lived in Brooklyn, blah blah blah, some more about his life story. I noticed another woman by us who kept turning around to see my situation. I decided to sit down next to her and whispered to her and asked her to pretend that she knew me. She told me she was going to approach me anyways because she knew this could be a dangerous situation. So, here the train comes. I decide to miss it and catch the next one, so this guy can just get on the train and go away. Chris comes up and taps on my shoulder. "Sophia, the train is here." I got goosebumps from his touch, and I started sweating a bit. Thank you, but I'm going to sit here with my friend and we're gonna talk for a while, okay?" I thanked the woman who helped me and hopped on to the next train after that guy had already boarded. When I got to the ferry station, though, I did not feel comfortable or safe. For some reason, I went up to this sweet-looking couple and explained my situation. They kindly offered to let me sit next to them on the ferry. Fortunately, they were traveling on the same bus after the ferry ride as well. You'd think the story would end there. The guy got on his train, went back to his home, and I never saw him again. But remember how this guy Chris said that he lives in Brooklyn? As soon as I sit down with this couple, I see the guy right there, walking back and forth by us. I informed the couple that this was the very same guy who had been creeping on me before. Honestly, I almost started crying. The couple comforted me, and the guy told me that he knew some martial arts, which did help me calm down a bit. However, this Chris guy would not stop circling us the entire time the ferry was moving, which was about 20 to 25 minutes. It felt like 300 hours that night, though. The creepiest part of this situation is that just when I thought we'd finally lost him after getting off the ferry, he walked out of nowhere right by me and whispered to me, "I hope to see you again, Sophia." I wanted to legit disappear from the earth in that moment. The couple told him off and threatened to call the police on him if he didn't stay away from me. Thankfully, the couple and I got on the bus together, and they gave me their numbers so I could let them know that I was back to my dorm safely, since their stop was before mine. When I got to the campus, I asked the security guy to drive me back to my dorm, and I did arrive home in the end without any other incidents. Back when I was 14 or 15, I hung around with a sizable group of friends. We would meet up in what we called the field, basically a huge park in the middle of a residential area, which backed up onto a cemetery. On one side was an imposing hotel with fairly large grounds, and on the other a fenced-in wasteland. We hung around towards the back of this field, which was surrounded by trees and bushes. Visibility was basically nil from the street. Added to that, it was very poorly lit as well. So we would build bonfires at night to provide our own light and also some warmth in the winter. During the day, large gangs of us would come and go. We'd head down to the shops or play curbs on the street. A local weirdo would walk by often, looking over his shoulders at us every few seconds, immediately averting his gaze if any eye contact was ever made. He would also shuffle around the corner, only to reappear at very regular intervals. He was an absolute creep, and this was displayed in his physicality as well. He was short and of slim build, balding with tufts of long hair creeping down the nape of his neck. As previously described, he would walk in this strange shuffling motion, abruptly stopping and turning around to watch us. His eyes would dart all over the place, and he never would make direct eye contact if he could help it. Being teens, and with the bravado of safety in numbers, we never actually really viewed him as a threat. The lads would roar at him, call him a perv and a pedo, and tell him to fuck off. We honestly gave him very little thought otherwise, to be honest. Well, one night, around November or December time, I'd arranged to meet friends in the field after dinner. Around this time of year in Ireland, it's pitch black by 4 p.m. This was at 6:45-ish, and I was about 15 minutes early. The field was completely black and empty, but with the fearlessness and naivete of youth, I strolled to our usual spot at the back of the park to wait there, by myself. Keep in mind, this was around 95 or 96 or so pre-everyone and their mother having a mobile phone. We had customed a little hut in one of the bushes, complete with branches that we used as seats. I settled down on one of them and lit up a smoke. All was silent for several minutes until I started to hear a slight rustling in one of the bushes. I was slightly concerned, but I figured it must be a squirrel or something. The rustling stopped for several moments after I noticed it, but then picked up again. Louder and more vigorous this time. Definitely not the work of a squirrel. Alarmed, I shot up from my seated position and tried to make out the source of the noise in this dim visibility. Out of nowhere, he emerged from the bushes. Pounced would be more accurate. He was mere feet away from me. He stared directly at me with the most menacing grin I've ever witnessed to this very day. Then he put his finger up to his lips in a shushing gesture. I bolted, through the bushes, branches whipping against my face. I stumbled at one point, catching myself before I fell completely. I ran out of that goddamn park in what felt like slow motion at the time. I ran straight to my house, which was about half a kilometer away. I don't know if he followed me. I was too scared to look back. I didn't see him again after. As I later learned, he spent several years in a mental facility. The next I heard of him, he had murdered his father, beating and eventually stabbing him to death. He was convicted of the murder and detained in a mental facility, like I said. I thought very little about him in the 20 or so years since that incident, until a few months back, when I saw him on my bus, gazing around creepily. He did look my way, but fortunately it seemed there was no recognition on his part. Regardless, I never want to run into that guy ever again. Context. This was about a week and a bit ago. I was on the bus from a shopping mall in Australia to a bus stop where I'd go get some food from a supermarket and then walk home from there. I was on the bus with my two friends, S and T. We each sat in our own seats, one behind the other, so it was S, T, and then me in the back. My friends and I are all 17, by the way. About 5 minutes into this bus ride, this very athletic-looking man got onto the bus. He was white, mid to late 20s or possibly early 30s, wearing a white and blue rimmed tank top, blue shorts, and some sneakers. His hair was also very short and dark blonde. Anyway, people are obviously getting on the bus and all, nothing very wrong so far. We were about halfway to my stop now, about 10 minutes after that man had initially gotten onto the bus. S was sleeping, T was studying for English, and I was on my own listening to music. I could see the athletic man looking back at us. I'm pretty sure he was observing T at first. My friends and I were sat on the left side of the bus, with the man on the right side, probably 3 to 4 seats ahead of us. I assumed he must have thought T was cute or something and was checking her out. But then I double-took and thought to myself, wait, what the fuck? She's 17, dude. She looks 17, and this man must be at least in his late 20s. The man stopped looking at T after I noticed him. Then a minute later, he glanced back at her, staring at her for an entire minute without even blinking. It seemed that T and S hadn't noticed yet, though. I looked back at the man, who then made eye contact with me and stopped staring at T. At this point, I was of course pretty sus, but I didn't say anything out loud. Then he started staring for a third time, this time even longer without even blinking. I glared at him because this was starting to get seriously creepy. He made eye contact with me again and rapidly glanced away. I texted T, "Hey, my bus stop is soon, maybe 10 or 15 minutes or so. And just to let you know, this creepy dude is staring at you. Be careful in case he's still on when I leave." I'm a male, by the way. T and S are females. T acknowledged my texts and nodded at me and cringed a bit. Anyway, they went back to reading, and I was still listening to my music, though this time keeping a much closer eye on the man. This time, though, the man turned around and started staring directly at me. His eyes were burning holes in my chest. I tried to avoid eye contact as he kept turning back around, glancing at me once again, a total of 7 times for about a minute each, excluding the times he had stared at T as well. Each time he looked back at me, he kept fingering the bus stop button to indicate to the bus driver that it was time to stop. He kept pressing it as he stared at me. I told T again to be careful. I realized the next stop was actually mine, so I pressed the button myself. The bus stopped and I got off and was getting off the bus as the athletic dude followed close behind me. He went in the opposite direction, but I turned around quickly to see what he was doing, just in case. He was walking down the footpath as I crossed. He turned around and saw me crossing, to which he responded by quickly crossing the road parallel to me. I took note and went to the store to get my soda or whatever. I walked into the Kohl's, but I realized that this man from the bus was now also heading that way. He was literally matching my footsteps, every movement, and even the exact speed. Every time I moved my left foot, he would too. He was just staring at me as I walked into the store. I walked into the aisle to get my Pepsi Max and looked around to see if I could see him still following me. Couldn't see him anywhere at this point. I walked into the self-serve line and was paying for my items as he walked past slowly out of nowhere, giving me the most evil glare I've ever seen. I quickly walked out of there with my items in hand and tried to see if he would follow me out. Of course he did. He was now speed-walking to catch up with me and didn't even buy anything from the store the entire time he was there. Needless to say, I fucking ran home. At least as fast as I could for 10 minutes. It seemed at some point he had given up though, even though he was athletic, because it seemed I had lost him. I have no idea where he went, and I haven't seen him ever since on that bus or anywhere else. Around 2012 or so, I lived in the industrial part of a city where there weren't very many houses nearby. Mostly just warehouses, trains, and some assorted businesses scattered here and there. Even during the day, it was quite rare to see people walking around, unless it was to or from the bus stop. One night, I was feeling a bit off. I think maybe my boyfriend and I had been arguing perhaps, or maybe my roommates were getting on my nerves or something. Anyway, I decided I needed to go for a walk that night. It was already cold and late, and it was well past midnight. I just really needed some fresh air and time alone to myself though. I was a 21-year-old girl who, at that point in my life, wasn't very concerned for my own safety or well-being. I wouldn't exactly say I thought I was invincible, but I definitely did some careless and stupid shit that sometimes makes me wonder how I even survived. This would definitely qualify as one of those times. I threw on my longest trench coat, some combat boots, a big fuzzy hat, and took off in a rush. There wasn't anything particularly scenic or pleasant to look at around there. I just went in the direction I knew best, toward the liquor store about a half-mile away. As I approached that store, I reached into my pocket and realized I had forgotten my wallet and my phone. As I approached closer, I realized the store was closed anyway, so I just kept on walking. Still in the light of the neon liquor signs, I heard a car approach me and slam on the brakes. I slowly looked over my shoulder to see the tip of my boyfriend's 90s silver Buick LeSabre moving alongside me. Very relieved, I looked into the driver's seat, only to see a man who was definitely not my boyfriend. He rolled down the window and shouted at me, "Get in the car." I was completely caught off guard, shocked, confused, and honestly kind of angry. "What? No, fuck you!" That was my response as I kept on walking. He kept pace alongside me though, as I continued to walk down the block. I kept on looking over, getting more and more annoyed, until I finally yelled at him, "Will you just fuck off?" He didn't do anything, just kept right beside me, staring at me with the window down. Suddenly he sped off in a hurry, and a huge wave of relief came over me. I really didn't know what to do next though, so I cut around a corner and started walking on the opposite side of the street, back toward my house, toward the oncoming lane in case he came back around. Which of course he did. He would stop alongside me, then creep slowly forward as I walked, all the while mumbling things to himself. He definitely seemed to believe that I was going to get in that car with him, because he surely was not taking no for an answer. This time at least though, there was a whole lane in between us. I really had nowhere to go though where this guy couldn't follow me. If I decided to take off running to my house, there was only one way to get there, through the deserted industrial area, following on down the road, which led to a tunnel under the train tracks. He would be able to follow me right to my fucking door, so easily with no witnesses. There was a 24-hour convenience store a mile in the other direction, but was that really my best option when it was so far away? I felt helpless in this situation. Out of nowhere though, I heard the chattering sound of people in an unmarked building beside me. Without a second thought, I frantically pushed the door in and entered a scene I will never forget. There were a bunch of sweaty men smiling and speaking to each other in Italian as they cheersed and finished their beards after a packed-up game of ping pong. They all stopped and looked at me as I shakily yelled to them, "There's a man following me outside. I'm really scared." It was silent for a second as they all eyed one another suspiciously, but then one guy offered me a ride home. I was so thankful to be in this stranger's fancy car for a whole minute and a half. I just kept apologizing and thanking him. He just kinda said, "It's okay, be safe, sketchy girl who just busted into our weekly tournament. Please don't be a weirdo." When I got home, I immediately looked up the non-emergency police line, but decided against calling. Because as I said, the dude was in the exact same make, model, and color as my boyfriend's car, who was likely to be in the same area shortly. Looking back though, I probably should have made that call. When said boyfriend did get home, he was furious with me that I would put myself in that situation. Like, sure, that was a dumb move by me, but what about this fucker who is lazily trying to kidnap me? Who the hell does that? I hope no girls met that guy again that night or ever in the future. And to those Italian dudes, thank you so much for having your hobby right when and where I needed you most. Perhaps a little late to the game here, but this is something I really wanted to share. I'm definitely a skeptic, but one experience I had house sitting for my aunt and uncle definitely raised some questions for me. They were going out of town for a weekend and asked if I would keep an eye on the house and take care of their dogs while they were away. I was staying with my grandparents for the summer, as I usually did, and being a 16-year-old with a brand new driver's license, I jumped at the opportunity for a few days of freedom with a house all to myself during summer vacation. I packed up my PlayStation, rented some games and movies, stocked up on my favorite snacks, and headed over to their house. The first night there was very uneventful, but I remember just feeling slightly uneasy even being there, even though nothing out of the ordinary was going on. I just attributed this uneasiness to being in the house alone for the first time, without my aunt and uncle there. Around 1 a.m., I decided to go to bed and let the dogs out in the backyard to relieve themselves before bed. After they were done, I made sure everything was locked up, doing the deadbolt and chain locks on the doors. I woke up the next morning, put some coffee on, and got the dogs to let them out. The uneasiness remained though. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, even though I knew for sure no one else was around. After breakfast, I decided to go out for a bike ride and meet up with some friends. I put the dogs in their crates, locked up, and headed out. I was gone for maybe 4 hours until mid-afternoon, when I decided it was about time to head back. When I walked back in, the dogs were freaking the fuck out. Not your normal, happy to see you, let me out of this crate now excitement. Full-blown panic, shaking, foaming at the mouth, howling, the whole works. These dogs were normally very calm and were perfectly content to spend most of the day in their crates sleeping if need be. Hell, sometimes they even went in on their own for naps, so this was really out of the ordinary behavior. I opened the doors to their crates, but neither of them seemed to want to come out. I was a little bit freaked out myself at this point. I decided to check the house and make sure nothing had actually happened. All the windows were fine, everything was still locked. The house was completely empty. I suppose at this point I should mention how the house is laid out a bit. It's an old house from the late 1800s, and prior to my aunt and uncle owning it, it was actually divided up as a duplex. The upstairs was a separate apartment. They mention an older woman had rented the upstairs while the previous owners lived downstairs. My aunt and uncle didn't rent out the upstairs, but they hadn't really done anything to convert the house back into a single-family dwelling. My uncle used the upstairs apartment as his home office, with several computers and a couple of modems, early 2000s dial-up. Most of the time, the door to the upstairs just stayed closed and locked. There really wasn't any reason for anyone to go up there. I decided in an abundance of caution, since the dogs were so freaked out, that I should check the whole house. I unlocked the door to the upstairs and went up to check. I noticed that one of the computers was on. This was odd. My uncle had said he had shut off everything upstairs and unplugged the surge protectors as well. Maybe he had meant to do so, but in a rush got out the door and forgot. No big deal. We were expecting storms later, so I shut that computer down, unplugged everything, and went back downstairs, locking the door tight behind me. By this point, the dogs had calmed down a bit and taken their usual spots on the couch where I joined them to play some PlayStation. After dinner, around 8 p.m. at this point, the dogs and I were still on the couch watching movies and just chilling out together. All of a sudden though, one of them stands on the couch bolt upright, with all the fur on his back standing on end, and begins growling in the direction of the door to the stairs. He continued this for the next 5 to 10 minutes, and nothing I did would distract him from whatever he was sensing. Eventually though, he did calm down and laid beside me again. A few hours later though, at 11 p.m., he started once more, and the other dog joined in this time too. That's when I began to hear creaking coming from upstairs, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. It didn't sound like footsteps. It almost sounded like someone rocking back and forth on a loose board. Properly freaked out now, I went to investigate. This time, I noticed that the door to the upstairs was now unlocked. I knew for sure I had locked it when I went up there earlier. Oh fuck, someone must be in the house. I took a few steps back into the kitchen and grabbed a knife. You know, like some horror movie cliche. I checked the porch door to the backyard, which would be where someone would come in to get to the upstairs apartment. It was still locked. Okay, that's weird. The creaking upstairs was still happening though. I opened the door to the stairway, and immediately it stopped. I turned the lights on and went upstairs. Nothing. I was freaking out over nothing. Probably just the house settling or something. It was, after all, an extremely old house. These things creak and groan on their own all the time. I was a little bit embarrassed with myself for getting so freaked out. I went back downstairs again, locking the door behind me. I decided to get some sleep, popped in another movie, and curled up on the couch and passed out. I was woken up a few hours later at 2 a.m. to the dogs again in full-blown panic mode. This time I could hear the creaking even louder, and then something else happened. I heard a dial tone. I heard the modem upstairs begin to dial some numbers, trying to connect. What the fuck? Was I still asleep, dreaming? No, I was definitely awake. I grabbed my knife tight in my hand and went to the upstairs door. Again unlocked. I opened the door and the noise immediately cut off. I went upstairs to check again. Nothing. Everything was still off and unplugged just as I had left it before. I went back downstairs, locked everything up, and went to try and calm the dogs down. Only 10 minutes later, though, I heard the modem start up again. It would dial, try to connect, stop, then repeat this process again and again. The creaking was back too. This time, though, it sounded like someone pacing around up there, even though I knew I was alone. I had checked every conceivable place in the house an intruder could be. I put up with this for another half hour or so, and it just would not let up. The dogs refused to calm down either. Eventually, I had enough. I grabbed the dogs with me, loaded them in my car, locked up, and got the hell out of there. I went back to my grandparents' place and stayed there for the rest of the night with the dogs. Of course, the next morning my grandparents were very surprised to see me there and asked what had happened. I relayed the previous night's events to them, feeling like a complete crazy person for what I had experienced. Strangely enough, though, they didn't seem very surprised at all. They then told me that wasn't the first time something strange had happened there. My aunt and uncle had all kinds of stories about that place. For example, my little cousin would frequently wake up screaming about a shadow man staring at him in his bed, or my uncle going upstairs to work on his computers one day and discovering the gas stove turned on but unlit, leaking gas into the house. All kinds of things being misplaced, doors being unlocked or left open after they had been locked before. I still don't think I believe in the paranormal, and I consider myself an agnostic atheist, but I can't really find a reasonable explanation for what I experienced that weekend. It was all just too weird.